Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Asad Lalji. Welcome to our next session of Avid Online. And for those joining us for the first time, a very special welcome to you. And so please refer to the chat box for more information on Avid Learning, the work that we do. And we hope you keep tuning in throughout 2021. This year holds such promise with the vaccine, cultural shifts that began last year, which have now come to fruition, and so many more innovations, inspirations, and perspectives to be made and discovered. And at Avid Learning, we use this extraordinary circumstances that 2020 brought upon us to innovate and transition our program online seamlessly and inventively. Our digital further learning campaign, Avid Online, began in April 2020 and has completed over 220 programs since then. And this year, we hope to continue our support for the arts and maintain our connections with the creative community and facilitate learning, continuous dialogue with our audiences. So whether we transition to physical events or have a hybrid of both, we stay true to our mantra that learning never stops. Over the weekend, we examined the way the visual arts world has adapted and changed during the pandemic in an illuminating session with Ranjit Hoskote, who spoke about art in the COVID-19 age. And finally, we continue this thread of inquest with today's session, which will address themes and perspectives of writing during these unprecedented times of the new normal. The Power of Prose, Writing and Healing in the Time of COVID, an illuminating live session that will help us understand the power and poignancy of writing, featuring leading voices from the literary and media worlds. Please allow me to introduce our very impressive speakers. Best-selling author Siddharth Shanghvi will be in conversation with writer, consultant, and former EIC Harper's Bazaar India, Nonita Kalra. For more about them, please refer to their extremely impressive bios that have been posted in the chat section. They were also emailed to you earlier. Siddharth will draw from his new book, Loss, and sections of other writings to highlight the power of writing about personal life experiences to confront, recover, and spread the message of healing beyond the self. In the conversation with Nonita, they will together dwell into the various techniques and creative approaches aspiring writers can use to weave a story around loss, to create a tapestry of hope from grief, and to spin a safety net of healing for both the writer and the reader. Please note the session would last 75 minutes and be followed by a 15-minute Q&A in which Nonita will be taking questions. So please keep posting them in the Q&A box. Just a quick note, that we've had a great opportunity to share signed copies of Siddharth's book. So in case, and many of our audience's members have registered and actually got a copy, but in case you haven't got yours yet, there's the link going to be there. So please fill in your name and information, and we'll make sure a book is mailed to you after the session. Thank you once again for tuning in. Over to you, Nonita, and look forward to a fascinating session.
Thank you, Asad, and thank you for giving me this chance to sit across my friend Siddharth 16 years after I first met him. In 2004, we were introduced to each other when I was to interview him on the last song of Dusk. It started a sort of crazy manic friendship that involved early morning calls and kind of obsessive love with each other, a love for many things, literature being foremost, Siddharth's ability to tell stories being the thing that bound us, his ability to help me navigate through my grief and our shared sense of loss. So it's not surprising to have this book in my hands, but what is surprising is that I've read it and reread it, and this was the third time I read it in the last 2 days, but I haven't been able to put down any sort of review of it. Because how do you review loss? What do you say? How dare we presume that we can judge someone else's loss? And I think that's what Siddharth does in this book so elegantly and so quietly. He shares a very, very personal story told with brutal honesty, told in a way that you will cry and you should cry because it will help you heal. But for me, and I'm going to start just by reading the thing that united us when we talked about the loss of both of our parents and our beloved pets. I'm going to keep it very, very brief because I know most of all, we just want to listen to Siddharth. Perhaps looking after my parents for as long as I had, the years of holding heavy medical files under my right arm, the years of making nice with insolent doctors, had sent this inner researcher packing. I was invulnerable to hope. I had come to believe that the worst would happen sooner rather than later. This is Siddharth talking about when his beloved bruschetta was diagnosed with cancer, how most of us would run to a doctor and ask, or run to Google, run to doctors, think we can beat it. But those of you and those of us who've had loss lose hope as well. And yet, I think one of the bravest things that Siddharth has done is put his heart out and written this beautifully produced book, because I don't think he lost hope. I think he used writing to heal. And is that true, Siddharth? Help me heal again, put together the pieces of my heart.
Thank you, Nonita. If you just allow me very quickly to backtrack for 1 second and thank Asad for this wonderful opportunity for us to have this conversation. You sitting across oceans and me sitting in my village in Goa. How grateful I am to him and to Avid Learning, and also especially my very dear friend Vasudha, who introduced me to Asad. I really hold space for her and honor her friendship that has allowed me to live some very difficult years of my life. As, of course, Nonita has your incredible friendship for 16 years, and that's something that maybe I didn't really address in the book, which is the role of friendship enough. And so immediately the Virgo in me is thinking of all the things I should have done, all the things that I did do, all the things that were wrong with this book, and perhaps I should have laid more emphasis on that. So I must make redress of my literary lack by acknowledging how profound the gift of your friendship has been over so many years. And in fact, I'm not in any place to give you hope. It's you who has given me hope, but also humor, which has led my hand across many shadowy months. Sorry, what was your question, Nonita?
Siddharth, you know what? Because we've talked about there's a unique club that forms when you lose your parents and you lose loved ones, and it is a club that loses hope. When something goes wrong, your mind goes to the worst, and you're not shattered by it. It's a weird resilience, and yet I think that you found hope in the way you wrote, and that's what I was so taken aback by the bravery with which you put this book together.
I don't know if I was brave as much as I was very aware of how vulnerable I was to grief. I think, wasn't it Joan Didion who says that grief, when it arrives, is nothing as you imagine it to be? And it is true. When it comes, it's both very delicate and extremely devastating. And that was my experience of it. I think the starting point of this book actually owes a debt of gratitude to its first reader. I wrote the first essay and I sent it to Amitabh Bachchan, who occasionally reads my work, will come back with me with very thoughtful remarks, ideas, observations. And he asked me if he could publish it on his blog. And it found a different life when Amit Uncle put it on his blog, because people from all across India began to write to me. I've never had this kind of an interaction. You live in a little bubble writing for readers who read in English, but when it goes out through medium of his blog, suddenly millions of people pay attention. The more important thing was I recognized that everyone was broken. We were differently broken, but everyone was broken. And that was the starting point for this book. And the recognition of how vulnerable we really were in grief, because everyone from little villages in Chhattisgarh to big cities like Delhi and Bombay were writing to me and saying that, yes, I see something very valuable and original and sincere in the writing of this piece that gave me the courage to say that, I needed to follow this idea. I needed to follow where this might take me. And that's how the other two essays came into existence. I think Viktor Frankl said something to the effect of the meaning of life is living it. And I always remember the words of Toni Morrison, who said that if death is the meaning of life, then language is its measure. So I wanted to take these two ideas of these two great writers and see how I could begin the writing of my book. That was the commencement point.
And yet we know that, writing about your experiences does help you heal. What was the process of doing this book? And were you looking to heal, or were you just at that point writing because that's the only thing you know how to do? And it's a funny thing to say, but you left writing, you became a curator, you became, you became an artist, you became a photographer, but you came back to it.
I never imagined I would. When I wrote The Lost Flamingos, I thought that was it. That was my exit point. I was done with it. But from the time that I published The Last Song of Dusk and moved on, and until The Rabbit and the Squirrel came out, I had lost my parents and my dog. So I was not just orphan, but very profoundly orphan and friendless. When you lose a dog, you lose your most important friend in the world. So in addition to losing my parents, I had lost this pillar of friendship that bruschetta had brought to me. Writing, was that little boat that just appeared when you're completely shipwrecked and you think, I'm going to drown. That was my SOS. That was my lifeline. That was what I did in the last 2 years in the writing of loss. It really saw me through. I think I'm a little suspect of this sort of slightly American idea of healing. That if we do this, then we heal. If you write, we heal. If we do enough amount of therapy or dhan or kriyas, and then you will heal. I like to think that I'm less destroyed today than I was yesterday. So it's all incremental. It's all step by step. It's day by day. And of course, the fact that I'm less anguished today doesn't mean that I couldn't be more anguished tomorrow. The tentativeness of this was what I wanted to explore for myself. And then perhaps in the form of a book, spur the reader to think about the profound influence of the ephemeral, how brief your life is, how fleeting it is, and how important it is for you to kiss the joy as it flies, to borrow from Blake. And that's really what this book was. It's easy to say that it's a meditation on death and grief. And of course, I say it all the time because it's a sort of convenient, easy, one-liner to kind of describe the book. But actually what it really is a appreciation of the lives that have informed my own. So when I'm writing about the deaths of my parents, what I'm really putting into focus was how generous they had been with me, in so many ways, with my mother being present for me and my father allowing me to be alone. These two very different gifts of presence were the things that became very, very apparent when I wrote Loss.
I've had the privilege of walking in and out of your house like it was my own, whether it was the bungalow or the studio. I've met Padmini, I've met your father, Bruschetta, I have held as a puppy, and she has not liked me very much as a grown-up because my voice was too loud for her. Do you remember this? She used to really scowl at me. But one of the things that I noticed and you write about your father particularly was his incredible loneliness. And he was very solitary. I'm not sure if he was always lonely, but you say later in life, and we saw him get lonelier and lonelier. Did you write this book to be less lonely? Or did you just write this to try and understand him better? Because when he was alive, and I know that you put this in the book very, very brutally, that the relationship wasn't always easy, that Bruschetta brought out the gentleness in him. He was very kind to me. I used to send him chicken tikkas from Delhi. And he thanked me and smiled at me once, which I remember just as a really big thing. But did you write to be less lonely? Because it sort of came through to me at some points.
I'm never lonely. It's really funny. I find that if you allow it, your loneliness will keep you company. And that's what's happened to me in the last 10 years of my life in Goa. I started off as a young person, very consolidated in my solitude because I had the books. And then I had the success of the last Song of Dusk and perhaps lost some of my way and meandered into society and high society and took several missteps, which I regret deeply now. But how lucky it is that life allows you revisions and second chances. And writing again, or returning to writing in Goa was that. In the case of my father, it wasn't really the loneliness, it was the recognition of his particular type of personality, that was both very generous but also extremely difficult. So how could somebody be so wonderful and yet have prickly edges? I think it's very true to type of a certain generation of Indian men, who were fathers who really loved you, but who had either a flaring temper or were just very removed from conversation, that they would kind of be really fully present for you, but then wouldn't know what to say, wouldn't know how to articulate, their love. What Brisketta did was that she became the link between my loneliness, my quietness, and my father's quietness. She was the little boatsman between, in the moat between my father and myself. So that was a really great gift. And that dogs do that for us all the time. If there is any kind of healing or mending or fixing of the pieces that occurs of our lives, dogs in so many ways are responsible. But with the case of my father, I was really watching him kind of age and meet his age and meet his death. One of the most profound things he said to me in the last years of his life, he had brain cancer, so he had a lot of issues with cognition, he had short-term memory loss. But he said to me, I would ask him, so, what are you doing? Like, Papa, like, talk to me. Like, why are you so silent? What are you doing? And he would look me in the eye and he would say, I'm praying for you. And I realized this was his way of speaking to me. This was his way of the conversation that I had never had, with my father. It was always there. I was just not hearing it. And now I hear it. And in the writing of loss, I hear it.
There was a lot of silence in your life, but I'm going to bring you back to a period when you were the toast of town. And you say that you regret it and there were missteps, but I was there. The parties were glorious. The people were glorious. I've met John Berend. I've met fabulous actors. We've met writers, photographers. Surely a writer needs that sort of stimulation to write books. Surely the mistakes help you write better. I mean, I understand, and we will come back to the power of listening because you talk about that a lot in the book. But the power of living, Siddharth, can you really take that away? Your studio, I mean, your house. You talk. I mean, you talk about the wonderful meals we've had. We've done garba to you two in every room in your house. I mean, those were magical days. Surely writers need that. You need an interesting life.
I was very grateful for that period. It was a very magic time, when India was sort of growing young all over again. This is 20 years ago, a flashback to in the days of my youth. And I was very grateful for those opportunities, for those friendships that came about. But the recognition of myself as an essentially solitary person, and therefore perfectly suited to the vocation of a writer, was lost in the nomination of my life into fame, into this accidental public success that I had. That's what I regret. I regret the fact that I believed some aspects of my life when all I should have done is kiss them while they were, being lived, and then gotten back to the writing, which I have been able to do now. And for which I'm very grateful. So yes, absolutely, I'm very grateful for all those friendships, those interesting events of, interesting writers and artists and love affairs. All of that informed the work, no doubt. But the only way you can really be a writer is by being alone and writing. That's how you pay your bills. I did lose sight of that, and I'm so glad that I recovered that just in good time, I think.
So this is a really interesting point that you raised, because we talked about this recently and you kept going back to it. Um, I was reading about healing and grief and writing, and Udipana Goswami at Johns Hopkins, she offers courses on healing through writing. She says life writing is about giving pause to the self to deal with this mound of reflection and to review one's life from a critical distance. Is that what you did then when you sat down to write Loss?
Um, I wouldn't say critical distance, because the people that I was writing about, I wouldn't dare to be critical about them, or at least not publicly critical. But as I said earlier on, the book grew into a constellation of appreciations, a constellation of appreciations of the fact that I had known these people at all, let alone the privilege of being their child. I have, in the writing of this book, come to find that death is it's a kind of a cosmic pause between two people's lives rather than a permanent ending. So instead of thinking that my parents are no more or my parents are gone, I think of death as a little space between them and me that allows me to look at them without the abrasiveness of life, without the prickle that comes into existence when two people are in a relationship with each other. So to take that step back and to say, wow, yes, of course we had difficult periods, but you were so incredible. Your courage. In the case of my mother, she suffered for 25 years. She was a scholar of pain. I don't know anybody like her. How can you be so remarkably brave and how remarkably joyous in the face of this much suffering? Those were the things that I got out of. So yes, you're right that there was a kind of a healing that you were referencing to that happens with writing, but mostly it was the sort of applause that I was giving my dad, who had very little conversation with in the last years of his life, but just the memories that would come back of how he would apply Vicks on my back when I had a cold, or how he would give me champi, in the evenings on Saturday. That was like the big weekend thing. We would be watching like a Doordarshan television set, and he would give us a champi. Those things will never come back.
Lucky you, right? The hand of God, the blessings. So
Yes.
that grief is private, but grieving doesn't have to be.
Hmm.
And I see that in your book. I know it's a celebration, but there is a grieving. And I was wondering, is there something you would like to read to us that you feel sort of epitomizes this, or the moving forward? It's such a complicated book, and I understand that it's a mix of their life and a celebration and an understanding, but all loss and grief are as complicated as that. And I was wondering if you felt like reading something for us so that we could look at it further.
So I'm going to read you a small passage, Nonita, and thank you for asking me. It's when a couple of months after my father passed away, and he used to go to a Srinathji temple on 10th Road in Juhu, where we lived, to pray most 3 times a week. He would go, I think, at 11 o'clock. And when I was back in Bombay, and I now live in Goa, I decided to go back to the temple where he used to go to pray. So I'm just going to read you a passage from that. Some months after my father's death, I was at the Srinathji temple on 10th Road in Juhu. My father came to this temple twice a week at 11:30 a.m. I was present at the same time he generally went. I saw old men with wiry sprigs of nasal hair propped up on plastic chairs, women with cane baskets of red flowers, priests in translucent dhotis. I'd seen versions of the scene in the holy town of Nathdwara, where my parents had taken me to the original shrine in my infancy. I need to say this again for myself. My parents took me on a pilgrimage when I was 9 months old. Standing before the idol, stoically and fabulously black, something skidded in my heart. I hoped no one might notice. I was crying. I'm sure some of the old people at the temple knew me, I thought. And while I had a reputation as a difficult man, now it was worse. In fact, I was a sentimental one. A small group of women were performing hymns. Their sonorous voices joined to make a sonic crown over my head. I continued to cry, covering my face, until I saw two other pilgrims at the temple. They were also crying. I was suddenly relieved. There were other fools here. They were just like me. They were standing before an idol and crying with folded hands. They were crying for mercy while I had been crying for grace. And no one at the temple seemed to mind it. Perhaps I'd not known this simple fact before. We do not go to temples to worship idols or practice faith, but to weep together so that our sorrows might be known. I stood in the same place where my father might have, in the same temple. I could feel the space and the song lines that our elders, our ancestors make and leave behind for us. They carve it out of their feeling for us. One day, without ever knowing it, we inhabit it as our secret inheritance. It's like the doorbell rings one morning and there's a delivery of a suit that fits perfectly. You're no longer naked. You are forever safe. You can arrive at any dinner now. The suit fits you in a way you cannot imagine. It fits you like a glove or the scabbard for a sword. I was embraced by this feeling that my father had left for me at the temple. In this feeling ran traces of love and hope and gratitude, and a grave, powerful recognition that I had his blood. He had made me. I experienced all at once my father's innumerable generosities, his stoic courage and solitude, his sudden stirring bursts of caring. I remembered he dropped me at school each morning. He kept aside the good reviews of my books in a clear plastic folder. He accompanied me to the dentist's chair as a child. I had never missed my father so much as I did just then. Toward the end of his life, I would sometimes ask him what he did all day, how he spent his silence. And he always replied with a big, beaming smile, "I'm praying for you."
I can see him. Tell me, in this particular paragraph or this excerpt that you read, if I was a young writer, the sense that I got from it is that you have to know who you are when you start to write. And since we're talking about the power of healing through literature, through acknowledging loss, I was wondering, was it easy for you to come to that recognition of who you are? Was it hard? How does one do this if we were to talk about that?
It's extremely hard, forming an identity, whatever that is for you, as a woman, as a straight man, as a black person, as a Dalit. They're little pieces, fragments that we gather over time and we put together. Luckily, writing allows a consolidation of those fragments in a way that very few people are allowed to, because you can revisit, what you were at 10, at 15, at 25, because hopefully you've kept notes or you've written books and you can revisit where you were at that point of time. So yes, for me personally, identity and the formation of identity was always through language, was always through distilling myself, even the setting aside, even the exfoliating of, this idea, the Indian idea of niti niti, not this, not this, and how that perhaps connects to your previous question of even the wonderful experiences I had in Mumbai. When I had access to very exciting lives. The most important thing was the exfoliation, was to live it and to be able to set it aside, to sort of say niti niti, not this, not this. So that's what identity has been for me. And that's what writing has done. It's allowed me to exfoliate, to set aside the unnecessary, to set aside the fat until what I really had was just the essential meat on the bone. So how lucky I was, to be able to serve that. It wasn't easy because there were so many temptations. There were, the retreat from Mumbai and Mumbai society and into the isolation of Goa, so that I could return to the writing, or I didn't even know that I was going to return to the writing, was the grave gift of embracing my solitude. So yes, absolutely, writing helps with the formation of identity, but there are so many other ways that people can do it, through music, through being a part of the community, of giving back, of being present for people, by reading to people, who would appreciate that. There are so many ways that you come into that, and writing is just one of that.
But as a young writer, if this was what I wanted to do, what should I be reading? And we talked about, some books, most of them were really old.
Well, should we talk about perhaps the sort of writing guides, on a very practical level? The Elements of Style by Strunk and White is a book that I go back to. It's a classic. It emphasizes
1920 for the first time. Do you know this?
Yes, and it's never been out of print. Millions of copies have been sold. It's a writing guide. I would hand it down to my nephews. I would hand it down to a young writer even now. John Berendt gave me this, and I've held on to it. It's called The Observation Deck by Naomi Epple, and it's wonderful. It's not just it's a book, but they have inspiration cards, and this one just happens to say read aloud. And sometimes, of course, when you read your work aloud, you recognize how it sounds to the reader, or you could pick out, another card from the deck. I feel like a tarot reader, and it says observe a ritual. And I remember reading an interview of Toni Morrison in the Paris Review, where she said that her writing ritual was that she lit a candle before she came to the writing desk. I would suggest, oh God, I mean, there are just so many wonderful Writing Down the Bones. That's such a beautiful, beautiful book. I love Anne Lamott's Bone by Bone, which is a book that I read when I was living in Berkeley. And again, it has the spiritual consequences of writing. I love that. So you could go back and revisit that. But really what you should be doing is just be reading writers you love and admire. Your master class is the book that is there before you. It could be James Salter, it could be Michael Ondaatje, it could be Truman Capote, it could be Upamanyu Chatterjee, it could be, the richness of those lives will find such profound ways of influencing your own, keeping your solitude company and nourishing you. You don't need to go to writing school. If you get into it, that's brilliant. That is the path that you should be taking. But if you don't have that access, if you don't have the privilege, I certainly didn't when I was growing up. What I learned from was immersing myself into the works of the writers that were beloved to me. And I found that, there is a kind of chorus of voices. If you hear them, you'll hear something from Michael Ondaatje that you've read, something from Seaball that will come back to your own text when you're editing it. I love that. I love how all these gurus, that they become these sort of voices behind you who come back to the text and help parent it while you're writing. So the easiest way to be a good reader is to read, to be a good writer is to be a good reader. Wasn't it Sartre who said that the two were interchangeable, that reading was a kind of writing, and I think of even the reverse being true.
It's something that I tell everybody who comes to me, and it's so funny that you said, first, when I read something, I'm like, just read it out aloud. Does it sound like it's in your voice?
Mm.
Read it loudly. And
Yeah.
every time you need to take a pause, put the damn full stop there because we tend to write really long sentences.
Yeah.
But I also tell them that when you're stuck, read, read, and read because it's so critical. And for us, I say start with newspapers, start with magazines, and we'll come to the power of that later. But one of the other things you talked about, Siddharth, that I think is critical to be a great writer is the gift that your mother had.
Mm.
That's of listening. And I think the more you listen, the more you absorb. And I've sat at Padmini's bedside while she was cooking a meal and she was calling for spices and all kinds of drama was going. But she would listen and then she would tell you, pull out that notebook, and she would read her poetry, all written, and then you were able to turn it into a really beautiful book for her. But Padmini sat in that room and listened. And I think she listened to you. She listened to your small heartbreaks, your large heartbreaks, your big stories, your funny stories. She waited to listen to you. And I think you talk about the gift of listening, and it struck me as maybe the thing that would help you stand out as a different writer, just the ability to listen.
I think my mother gave me two births. One was obviously the physical birth, but she also birthed the writer in me. Because my mother was disabled, we were her kind of eyes and ears to the rest of the world, So we had to come back to her bedside and tell her we saw this, or this aunt is now going completely bald and it's a bit traumatic. We can't really go to these Diwali luncheons. So, the amplification of the ordinary into the extraordinary was what she taught me, because she was in one bed. She hadn't left that bed for 20 years. So imagine how she was living her life by throwing herself into the narrative of other people, into this great act of listening. That's why I think for me, reading is such an important thing because that's the service readers are doing for me. They're listening to me. So, if I can just bow 1 million times to everyone who read Loss because they brought it into existence. If it wasn't for their quietness, if it wasn't the little space that they gave it, the book wouldn't exist. It wouldn't exist for me. It might exist as a physical object, but it actually exists really in the solitude of the reader's imagination. That's the practice I also got from being around my mother, by being present for her, being her eyes and ears to the outside world. And to that I would add also my grandfather, Nonita, Dr. Arvind Vasavda, who was a Jungian scholar who learned dream analysis from Carl Jung. And he gave us very profound permission as children to take our subconscious lives seriously, because he would sit us down on this, at the side of his bed and say, tell me about your dreams. Can you imagine what that was for a 10 and 12-year-old, where you kind of dismiss their interior life, most adults do, or a lot of adults do. But here you had this very refined mind saying, I want to know about your dreams. Tell me what you dreamt about last night. And also what that did was it made us take our subconscious life more seriously. But then you knew you had to perform a story, because he wasn't saying, sitting there and listening to you babble. He was listening to you for a story that, you went from here, and then he would help you deconstruct that. And a lot of writing is that, you put things together and then you take pause and you look back and say, this is what this means to me. So that kind of really erudition, that kind of tuition that I had at the bedside of my mother and my grandfather, that's invaluable. And that comes from listening.
That comes from listening, that comes from self-editing and being taught to edit. And one of the things we've been talking about a lot, and the difference I've seen in your work, Last Song of Dusk was very clearly a young boy's writing. You loved every sentence you'd written, and because you loved it so much, your reader loved it. But today, if you were to write that, it would be too self-indulgent. Loss is sparse, and it is never a word I thought I would use with you. It's sparse. I I kept looking for more. I kept trying to reach into the pages and go, where's my Siddharth? Why? What happened here? And you said it was editing. You said you worked with great editors, and I know that you worked with some extraordinary editors. And I know a lot of this was edited yourself. I'd love to know your experience about this process, because I think it makes the difference between a good writer and an average writer.
You know, I was 22 when I wrote the first draft of Last Song of Dusk. It's a book that I'm very grateful to. It was my passport into adulthood. It was my passport into the lives of people like yourself. But it was an extravagant book. It was a book by a young writer. And I wish now, if there was one takeaway, if a younger writer was here today with us, and I hope there are many young writers with us today, is I wish that book had been better edited. I wish there was somebody who was less impressed with it and sat me down and said, you know, there's some wonderful things about it, but these are the things I'd like you to address. I wish there was somebody who was very strict with me. That wasn't the case. There were two reasons I can give you for why I think there is a kind of a sparseness or an essentialism to loss. One is, I think, the 7 years of my practice as a curator. That you come into a space, you have 25 works, you have to organize them in 3 or 4 rooms. You have to give each work the gravitas, the significance that it really needs. And its own identity, right? You need to give that to the work. So the curation taught me how to organize my own material, because right now I was doing that for other people. I was looking at, you know, photographs. You know, we did a show of Sunita Raporwala's photographs or William Dalrymple's photographs. When William gave me his show, there were like 3,000 photographs, which we had to whittle down to 30. So that process was extraordinary of whittling down, of, you know, editing, of exfoliating. That was 7 years of a kriya, of a tapas that I did in Goa, that I came to loss. The most important thing that I would share as an experience of mine with younger writers is, if you can find allies with editors, please make those. It's more valuable for you to know editors who will be able to look at your work with detachment than writers who will be looking at your work with great pleasure or sometimes jealousy or awe. What you need in your life are fine editors. In the case of Loss, I was very lucky to work with 3 of them. Uday Mitra, who was the publisher of the book and who did a very large edit and help me kind of put it together, including the physicality, where we should break pages, where paragraphs should be broken, how chapters should be broken. It was really profoundly invested. This book owes a debt of existence to Udayan. Then I worked with Mark De Silva, who is an extraordinary writer, the author of Points of Attack and Square Wave, and editor with the New York Times Magazine, and a columnist with the paper in seasons past, who I have never met in my life, who has edited me when I wrote for the New York Times, went on to become a friend and edited, you know, The Rabbit and the Squirrel and Loss. And then the third editor was Braun Sibri, who, you know, who's a wonderfully gifted writer out of Perth, you know, who brings the flourish of extraordinary readership with her very emotional engagement with the text. And I must say this here, that it's very important to also work with a woman editor. You know, you can have the detachment. I mean, of course, I don't believe in gender, and all strengths come from all genders. You know, so both flaws and talents are equal opportunity employers. But she brought a very, very distinctively female intelligence, you know, that really gave me the spark to explore things that I had begun to think of as sentimental. You know, think of as, oh, you know, I really don't want to write about, you know, me crying at a temple. But Braun would say, no, you must. This is really important. This sets into context how this death has impacted you. So that kind of illuminating female intelligence that she brought was a wonderful, beautiful counterpoint to what it is that Udayan and Mark do. And the reason I'm speaking so expansively about my experience with working with them, Nonita, is because you see their information on every single page. And in fact, I think that if you go back and read the interviews of writers like Michael Ondaatje, they will, they're wonderful minds of information of how editing is as important as writing. Because in the case of, say, if you deconstruct The English Patient, I believe he said it took him 5 years to write it. So he wrote the first draft in a year and a half, and then spent 3.5 years editing it, which is why the book kind of oscillates between time and space. You don't really know where you are, and then suddenly you figure out that right now I'm in Italy or I'm in India. Editing, having wonderful collaborations with editors, that is one of the life lessons that I would absolutely share.
How long did you spend editing Loss? What was the whole process for you?
So, I wrote it. It was ready to come out last February, and then the pandemic broke, and I had the solitude of my life in Goa to kind of to revisit this text, to edit it in just this very holy isolation of my life in Goa, where I didn't meet anybody for so many months. And I think that's what brought this book the kind of sparseness that you recognize. Can we maybe just also speak briefly, while we're on the subject of talking about editors, maybe a few things that can help a young writer? Would you give me permission to talk about?
I would love that, and I would love if you would share something you've read that also sort of hit home for its editing and sparseness. But yes, what would you tell young writers?
Well, the most important thing I would say is just start. A first sentence, a paragraph, a title. Start. You can have the best ideas, but if they're in your head, they're in your head. That's one. Second, I would say, is sit still. In the world that we're in, the emphasis on movement, the emphasis on going places, seeing places, which is sorry?
Yeah, on the busyness of life, the emphasis that we place, which is
on
ridiculous.
The busyness of life, on the sense that, it's important to go out, it's important to see this, it's important to meet. Of course it is. But the work will come when you are still, because you have to give the muses fair warning of your commitment to the work. They have to know that you are on that desk and you're not leaving until they appear, until the words are there. That commitment has to be there. The third thing I would say is give a break between the time that you write and the time that you begin to edit, because that gap is really valuable. It's really interesting that with The Last Song of Dusk, I would write. I was a student in California, so I would write after my classes, and then in the morning I would get up really early and edit. What I didn't realize is that I was so in love with those sentences as a 22-year-old that I never really edited them fairly. I didn't edit them with the brutality that they needed to be. So I would suggest that keep space between writing and editing. Fourth, if you can hire an editor on the work that you're working on, that I know is an extravagance, but it will be the most meaningful investment that you will ever make. If you can collaborate with an editor, please do it. And the fifth thing is what you and I have talked about. Just read. When you feel like you can't write, when you feel like you're stuck, when you feel like, okay, I just don't have the words, sit down and read. It is your practice. It is your riyaz before the song appears. So read if you cannot write, and the words will appear.
That sounds exhausting. You do.
It is. That's why a writer's life is not something that most people nominate. Nobody goes off and says, I don't know if you remember that anecdote of a young writer bumping into Philip Roth at a grocery store, and saying, what's your advice to young writers? And I think he said something to the effect of, don't do it. After writing for close to 50 years, he turns to a young writer and he says, don't do it. I would encourage young writers to do it, yeah, even if it breaks you and dismantles you, even if it's exhausting. The exhaustion is really beautiful. It's an exfoliation of yourself until what exists is only the essential. And that's a really great gift to give yourself before you die.
But you also have 5 pieces of really, really sensible advice to navigate the writing world, right? And one of the things you say is keep a second job.
Absolutely. I don't think I would have been able to make a living off my writing. I did do, when I had the great success with The Last Sound of Dusk, I was able to make very sound investments. I then went on to do a series of jobs to pay for my life, whether it was to design homes, whether it was to curate shows, whether it was to write, manuals out for corporates. I had to do it because, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to pay my bills from the writing alone. And I had to have a second job. So I would say keep a second job. The other thing I would say to navigate the writing world is a lesson that Thomas Keneally, the author of Schindler's List, told me when he was visiting me in Goa, which is that he gave me a really important advice, that he said, be generous. One of the ways that he manifests that was, he said, I'm in my 70s, or that's what he was, at the time. And he said, I don't have all the time of the world to pursue the most interesting ideas I have. So when I meet young writers, I tell them that, look, I might be dead. I won't have the time. I don't have the stamina. You take this idea and you write this. And I thought, wow, what an extraordinary gift that he was going off and giving young writers, saying, I don't have the time or the energy, but you can do it. So be generous. The other thing I would say is listen to your critics. Listen to your critics in a way that they become enabling forces in your life. For me, at an early stage, they became disabling forces because I took a lot of that criticism to heart. I took it very personally. I would say listen to the criticism in just the way where you can suck the nectar out of it, take the very best thing out of it for yourself and leave the rest. I would encourage young writers to avoid the literary world as far as possible. The literary world is you and the page. Whether you meet writers, whether you go for literary book events and win prizes, that's great. How lucky you are to have all of that. The real literary word is right here. It's between you and the page. Don't ever forget that. And the most important thing that I learned from 20 years of writing is that you will be rejected more often than you will be accepted. That's an occupational hazard when you become a writer. Deal with it. You're just going to face more rejection than you will acceptance, but you have to write through it. I think it was Toni Morrison who said that one of the reasons that there weren't good novels being produced is because there weren't good reviewers. And I took so much of the harsh reviewing that I received quite early on in my writing life to heart. It made me pause. It took many years out of my life. So to the young writers out there, who are sharing their work, who are perhaps getting harsh criticism, I would say, take strength. Take strength in your own conviction. Be solitary. Keep writing. You will come to a place of clarity. You will face the rejection. That's par for case. Right into the acceptance of the word for yourself. That's the space you want to be in.
No, I was going to ask you this because your works often get a lot of criticism, and it surprises me that in the literary world there is this harshness. How do you then? And here we are sitting talking about writing to heal, but if you're going to be terrified, what do you do then? How are you writing to heal? Are you writing to hurt then? Right? So I mean, I think that in as much you've answered all of these questions by telling people, well, avoid this, listen to your critics, build thicker skin.
Yeah, absolutely. But I do genuinely mean it. If you have a sensible critic, and you will know that as a writer, if you have enough detachment to your work, you can enter it and say, yes, this person is being very harsh, but they're being very correctly harsh. And that obviously also comes with time. When I was 26 and I brought the last song of Dusk out, it just felt like an avalanche. It felt really, really personal. And now it feels less and less so. So all the writers who say, I never read my critics, and I'm immune to all of this, that is really bullshit. That everyone reads, what's written on a blog about their book, or a stray comment on an Amazon review, and you keep it. But you have to make it useful to yourself. That comes with time, and it will happen for the young writers who are here.
So that last song of Dusk was also about loss. Do you remember the first time I read it? I told you it made me very sad. It was very there were stories or versions of your mother in it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering, how differently have you written about your mother this time? Is there an excerpt you'd like to share with us? I'm also being selfish because I love hearing about Padmini through you.
Yes, I'm going to read an excerpt from the essay that I wrote about my mother. And thank you for giving me the opportunity to. I really appreciate that. A spit of beach in Morjin, where the Chapora River enters the Arabian Sea, is concealed by a grove of pine trees. Ignored by most tourists, its isolation makes it a favorite of middle-aged Russian nudists who live in Goa several months of the year. In the distance is a fort with damaged turrets and embrasures at its base, another beach with a temple, a quay for fishermen's boat. Bird life includes plovers, Brahmini starlings, kites. A few years ago, an 11-foot mugger, crocodile, accidentally ended up here. A local had shot it on his phone while it was doing its threatening high walk after the neighborhood dogs began to bother it. On most days, I come here to swim in the estuary, where I see sometimes dolphins in the headwaters. I walk the length of the remote beach, standing against the wind, looking out at sea. The sky is icy blue without any clouds. At the age of 42, I have set aside much of my past, not through erasure, but by acceptance. When I'm swimming in the sea, as I do each evening, it is possible to go out so deep that you can no longer see the shore. I might feel marooned, helpless, or I might thrill from an overwhelming sense of abandon. A plover comes into view, then a grove of pines. The shore is there, of course. I can see it, its smooth white sand undulations. I swim back to the shore, wondering where my mother is. After all these years, I am still looking for my mother.
Well, we did get to meet her in the book. And I have to say that it was very special.
Thank you. Thank you for being such an excellent friend to her, of sitting next to her bedside in your beautiful black shift dress and really,
black dresses, sitting next to Padmini as she told us hysterical stories of repurposing curtains and kaftans to make you the ugliest shirts known to mankind. But Siddharth, all of this conversation, this welling up, this emotion, it makes me think of something that we were talking about. We've had the privilege of mourning. And I think that what we were talking about is 2020 has also shown us that it's been such a difficult year. And you've written about it in your very, very hard-hitting pieces of journalism, which, were often my favorite pieces of your writing. You've written about the migrant workers and how they've not had that privilege. And I would love to end our conversation with this privilege of mourning.
I was very affected by the way that all of us collectively, the urban elite, this book reading, Zoom meeting attending milieu of urban India, and the way that we never really looked at our fellow citizens as equals or even as people. And when we kind of shut our doors to them, and these brothers and sisters, our brethren, walking in that sun, back home, exiled from the life, this very little life that they had lived, and made our lives so much larger, and allowed for our lives to be lived with so much ease. And this is what we did, when push came to shove, we kept them on the wagon, we shut our doors to them. All of us did, most of us did. That really moved me to think about even this idea that, writing this book, what an extraordinary privilege. It seems almost kind of twee to say that, I can think about healing, I can think about loss, I can think about grief, I can decorate it with beautiful sentences, when grief, when loss for most people is so brutal. The image that comes back to me from 2020 repeatedly are not those horrible images of people, making banana bread and talking about how the isolation and lockdown was a kind of an extended vacation, or how, they suddenly became close to their siblings and husbands. I mean, there was a worker, Rampokar Pandit, and he was trying to make his way home to see his few-month-old infant, and he wasn't allowed to cross the border from Delhi. And then he gets a call, and he's told that his child has died, and he's walking. He's been sent out of, as he was a laborer, he was sent out of the site. He's walking home to see this child, and on the way, he's not allowed to cross the border. That kind of, and then he gets this call, and it says, your child has passed on. He sits down on the side of the road. He removes his black masks. He's got the phone to his, and I think it was a photograph captured by Atul Yadav, the photographer. And he's just sobbing. That's really what grief is for most people. It's sitting down on the sidewalk and weeping your heart out. So I can come to this with the privilege of my educated life and of living, in isolation in Goa because I choose to. But that's the real grief, So it's so wonderful that you allow me to hold space for the largeness of that condition, of that human suffering. And at the same time, Nonita, this book has brought me closer to readers than any of my other books, because I think that I had no filters between me and my work, and I was just presenting what it is that I had lived through, and people responded. But that image of Rampokar Pandit sitting on the side of the street and weeping, to me, that's the grief. That's epic, and I really hold space for that in this conversation.
But Siddharth, when you wrote about it, I think you made people realize what was happening. And we've talked about loss and healing and writing to heal, but I do believe in the power of words. And I think that we've managed that, you've managed that. People are reading more than ever before. Books are back. What a great thing. And I think it's because words and connection in a post-COVID world mean different things. Would you agree with me?
Absolutely. And books have, fared really, really well, because people have realized is that you can't derive the spiritual nourishment that's essential to your life from your phone. You're not going to get that from an app.
Not that you get it from banana bread.
Virginia Woolf, I think, somewhere said this, where I think she was talking about what makes a novel such a great work, a form of art, was because it gives you the privilege of interiority. Even when you're looking at cinema, you're looking at photographs, what you're doing is, okay, this is the story, this is what the character looks like. But with a novel, you have to make that up. And what the lockdown did was it began to make us realize that we were wonderful sources of our own entertainment. If we just relied on our own imaginations, we could derive tremendous spiritual and psychological nourishment from that. And if a book could help you parent, not my book, but other books could help you parent that process, how wonderful. How wonderful that it took a pandemic, to make us realize what it is that we must leave behind.
Which is our phones.
At least for some of the time.
Our imagination. Siddharth, you talk about sort of seizing the imagination. This conversation has clearly resonated with our listeners. So I am actually going to get to the questions a little earlier because we've got so many questions that I would like to try and answer as many of them. Oh my God, this is endless, but I'm going to do my best. Harish asked something about the design of the book. He says, I love the cover, the whole black inlet, the bare edges near the seams, black thread which is bare in between the pages, the feel of the pages. It's so amazing, almost like the design of the book had a different story to tell. How did this happen and was it intentional? Um, Before you say anything, Siddharth designs beautifully. He designs homes, he designs spaces, he designs meals and conversations. Siddharth, I had to put that in to give context.
Well, that's very generous of you. And what I would do is take that compliment and give it and put it at the feet of Bonita Vaz, who's the designer of this book, and who single-handedly made the book as beautiful as it is. All homage for the design of this book is to her. I simply had to say to Bonita when she came to see me in Goa to talk about this process of what I wanted the book to look like. And I said to her, give me something as beautiful as a gravestone, a place of reflection, a place of memory. And I think that's what she took that sentence and then she just built this book. So it's entirely Bonita's genius that you're looking at. So thank you, Harish, for that question.
I did think it was very beautiful that you included the images of your father and of Bruschetta, and these were photographs that you had shot. Had you studied photography, Siddharth, or you just picked up the camera? I remember you just using it all the time.
Yeah, I was very lucky. I had studied photography at university, but this was, it's a testament to how old I am because in those days we were using film and we would go into the dark room and develop our own film. This is all before digital. Although the photographs that I shot of my father, which are an essay unto themselves in loss, those were, on the digital format. So they were the first draft of this book. You'll be amazed as what can be a first draft for your writing. For me, they were the photographs, that I could go back and revisit them for the details, revisit them for where I was at a certain point of time in my life.
Which was your favorite image out of all of those? Very quickly, there was the one of Bruschetta looking out.
I know. I think my favorite images of my dad eating alone on his table, on his dining table, because I have it right here in my house in Goa. And my dining table is right where the image is. So it's a continuation of that loneliness, of that isolation, of that solitude, because I eat my meals here alone, like he did. But there is no fear of loneliness. There is no fear of isolation. There is a great embrace of the solitude.
I love that in his hands, I see your hands. And, I've known you so long. And when I was going through the book, I saw that and I felt the sense of continuation. And suddenly everything felt better, which was a very strange feeling. You have another question. This is an anonymous person. What writers or books have helped? What writers or books have you come across that can help children deal and understand loss?
Oh, wow. Because I don't have a child, I haven't really processed that. I'm going to have to read up about that. about what a child should read. It's a starting point for me to write that book. So I would have to very honestly say, I don't know. It's taken me 20 years to come to this place where I can confidently say, I wish I had an answer for you, but I don't, but I'm going to think about it.
And perhaps just in the reading of the book, because I think that your mother told you a very lovely story of how she dealt with the loss of Utpal, which I thought was very beautiful. And you grew up under the umbrella of the loss.
Hmm.
And I'm just wondering, maybe that, this the person who asked this question, if she was to read the book, maybe that would help her.
Sure.
Um, I found that very, very moving and very typical of Padmini, to have incredible logic in the most illogical way. It was really beautiful. Apurva asks you, Apurva Shah, when you write a personal story, should one focus more on facts or the emote? I thought some element of story is needed to connect, but beyond that, it's important to express the emotion that many may have felt but kept muted. How do you decide how much to reveal about facts, and when do you stop and focus on the emotion?
To me, the both of them, thank you, Purva, for that question. For me, both of them were connected, Nonita. So what the curation taught me, the years that I served as a curator, was what do you want to keep out of a show? What are the works that are beautiful, but they simply don't belong to the show? That was a learning that I brought to the writing of loss. What are the details that you don't want to share, and you want to allow the reader to make up that? You don't want to tell everything so that reading becomes a prescriptive act. It's never meant to be prescriptive. It's an imaginative engagement between two people. So you want to give the clues. So you might want to mention a little prickle. You want to mention a little silence between two people, but you don't always want to give the reason behind that. You want to allow the reader the privilege of imagining the reason for that. So that was what curation brought me, and that's what I began to do. Is I would take certain aspects of my relationship with my parents and speak discreetly about them, including the difficult aspects. I didn't want to write, an American memoir, where you're sort of vomiting, your childhood all over somebody else's imagination and solitude, and saying, this happened to me and this was terrible and how awful it was and blah, blah, blah. Sure, lots of things in my childhood, as they are for you, for all of us, were terrible. But what is it that you want to say which is going to bring meaning to somebody else? Because it can become a kind of entertainment. You can just say, this happened to me, somebody beat me when I was 12, at 16, all of this is very valid and valuable information. What is it that you can take out of that can have some resonance for your reader? How can you put that at the service of a reader's imagination? That can be a very important question if Apurva is working on something, to see how he wants to answer.
I
I
also
believe the question with a question.
I thought that you also left everyone with a lot of dignity, and maybe that was just such a simple rule. Everybody was left with some amount of privacy and dignity.
There is one thing that I do want to say, which is that there was somebody who didn't deserve that. And I think I can say it now. When Bruschetta was dying in her last moments, I called up my neighborhood vet, because she was really sick, and we had to put her out of her pain. And I remember that veterinarian who has a clinic in Juhu on 10th Road, and he said to me, well, you don't come here any longer, so why don't you go to the veterinarian that you go to normally? And I think this man deserves to have his license suspended. So, to answer Apur's question, you can give dignity to most people, but not in such cases, not in a case where it's not deserved. And this veterinarian didn't deserve it. He has a clinic on 10th Road in Juhu. He doesn't deserve to have a clinic. He doesn't deserve to have a license.
There's another question from an anonymous attendee who says, can the writing of a book like this change the author? And did this happen for you?
Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. It allowed me to consider another book. That's the greatest gift that your previous book can give you. If it can give you the confidence to say, you did a few things that were all right, and so maybe I give you permission to write another book. So that's what loss did. All the confidence that I had lost in the many years, loss gave it back to me. So that if Last Song of Dust gave me a passport into adulthood and into public office, loss gave me passport into private office.
That's beautiful. Subhashish asks you, Siddharth, often the extent of loss is not realized unless one experiences it firsthand. Words such as aap, biti, and bhukt bhogi in Hindi come to mind. How often can the power of prose influence the reader to sense and genuinely feel the loss?
It's entirely up to the reader. I can never come into that space and expect anyone to feel. If the question is in reference to my book, that's not something that I privilege myself. What the reader, what she takes away from the book is entirely her experience. Did I understand the question correctly? Am I answering it?
No, I think that's the right answer. I
Okay.
mean,
Yeah.
Um, another anonymous attendee asks, can you tell us the role memory plays with the mechanisms of mourning, coping, and healing? I think this is a beautiful question.
It's a beautiful question because it plays a very devastating role. And for me, I remember that at some point, um, I had begun to think of only the best things about a lot of these relationships. And you can't do that. You have to see the person in the sum of who they were, because that's love. If you glorify somebody and say, they were so extraordinary and they were so wonderful and they did this for me, they did that for me, that's important, but that's not enough. The highest form of love is acceptance, and acceptance can only come when you see the person for their wholeness, for their prickle, for what it is, what damage they did you, and how you came through that damage. That's a really important, life lesson that I got out of it. So don't use your memory to glorify, to sanitize, your past relationships, but to look at because that's really the only service you can do to somebody, is to remember them for the fullness of who they were, for all their, rough edges and the damage that they did you. It's really important to look at them like that. Oh, it was for me.
No, I agree with you. Shahana Shanoy wants the list of books mentioned in this discussion. I am just wondering if the Avid team can just put it down for everybody. It might make more sense than us repeating it. Or Siddharth, what do you want to do?
I can just add that, I hope you read Anne Enright. I hope you read John Didion. I hope you read Paul Kalanithi. I hope you read James Salter. I hope you read Upamanyu Chatterjee. I hope you read Jhumpa Lahiri. Please go back. These are books way better than my own. So I would encourage you to spend more time with them. And of course, Toni Morrison. Anybody who's starting out here, I would just ask you to go back and read Beloved. I would ask you to read Michael Ondaatje. I would like you to read Truman Capote. These are all, I feel so much love for these people. Amy Tan, my God, Amy Tan taught me how, so Amy is obviously an extraordinary writer, and you should read The Joy Luck Club. You should read, when Saving Fish from Drowning. All her books are wonderful. But my relationship with her taught me how important is generosity among writers. So much of my faith came back because she would write to me, in the irrelevance of my life in this village in Goa. She would send me a WhatsApp and saying, Siddharth, go back to the writing. This is wonderful. You need to do this. I believe in you. So if I could only do that for a younger writer in this conversation, I'd like you to know I believe in you. I need you to understand this. I have not met you. I do not know. I do not have the good luck and the fortune of knowing you. But you must know that there is a reader out there who believes in your writing. For me, it was Amy, repeatedly giving me, it was like she brought a skin over the wound that so many critics had caused, knowingly or unknowingly, to me, and for which I will never forget. That's a debt of resurgence. That's a debt of healing that she did for me, which I can never repay, but I can certainly try and pass it on.
Amy describes Siddharth as an original, a major storyteller who beguiles us into a world of illusion and bestows us with a sharp-eyed lens into the heart. I thought this was very, very beautiful. In a personal story, there are many times Siddharth has sat with me and done outlines of books on little pieces of paper and said, just write. I haven't written, but I have every one of those slips in my wallet, Siddharth. So that is a wonderful gift that you give and you pass it on. There's another question from Subhashish. She says, Virginia Woolf once said, we never treated pain as seriously as war, politics, or gender. Would devastating times of conflict, of trauma, war, disease, calamities, terrorism, and so forth act as a catalyst to further literature on healing, grief, loss, and putting the pieces together?
I think that line is from her essay on pain, if I'm not mistaken, where she talks about how we never treat it with the gravitas that we treat subjects, male subjects, like politics, like war, that so much of literature, because it was written by men and reviewed by men, you gave it the kind of eminence, you gave the male experience so much room, you put it at the center of the discussion. And what people like Toni Morrison, Virginia Woolf, Emily did was to recenter the narrative and to say that, this is really important. Pain, it doesn't have a language. It doesn't have enough words for us to describe the shrieking, the hollering, the anguish of feeling singed by memory. Absolutely, what women writers have done is for me, to put emotional life at the center of writing, as opposed to these very opaque and very boring straight male ideas of war and politics and class, all of which is true and valid. But what women writers did was to give the ineffableness of life, which is at the center of the human experience, the kind of stage that it deserved. They were the ones who went out there and said, this needs to be said. Nonita, before you take the next question, what I would say when you were talking to me about the slips of paper, I hope that I can put you on the spot, and I hope that perhaps there are also publishers and editors here today who will reach out to you and ask you to write your book, because you have such a singular gaze at the world of fashion, but more largely the world of aesthetics in India. You were a legendary editor, years with Elle, years with Harper's Bazaar. You shaped that narrative. You gave young designers the platform. You gave young writers that stage. I hope you really go back and revisit what it was, the excitement, the defeats, the regrets, the illuminations of that time, and write a book. I would hope so much that, I would be lucky enough to read some chapters out of that in the coming months.
I'm taking notes once again. And yeah, Siddharth has had this conversation with me earlier and told me that we need to work on this. But this is the generosity, I think, that he was talking about. Siddharth, there are a lot of questions from young writers. I'm just going to put them together because I think we have less than 5 minutes. Manisha wants to know, when will her work be ready to be shown? An anonymous attendee wants to know, is there any message you'd like to give aspiring writers? And Minal wants to know the importance of the first draft, where you write everything that comes to your mind, and after a gap you come and edit it. Should the first draft in itself have to be good and inherently present? What advice do you give young writers? Because that's what I think we need, writers and editors, because I think you've inspired a whole bunch of young writers to realize that they could also be great editors.
I would never think of myself of being in a position to advise somebody, but what I was trying to do in that conversation was share a few of the things that have worked for me. So I'm coming to this as somebody who's having a beer with you and telling you, try this. The question about, so can we just revisit the first question from Manisha, which was,
when do you know if your work is ready to be shown and past the self-editing phase? You know, a lot of young writers have problems starting out and they all want to know how to get published, when are they ready, when do they stop editing, how good should the first draft be?
in cheese making, there's a process when, when the milk is turning and then suddenly the mozzarella appears. There's a kind of formation and it's ineffable. You can see it. And that's what will happen to Manisha. When she sees and revisits her text, she'll know that it has all consolidated and it has come together for itself. And that's the moment that she should take it out. And there was a third question, sorry.
The question about any message you would like to give aspiring editors and the importance of the first draft.
The first draft is the draft that you throw out. So, that's the most basic thing that you do with it. You revisit it only to set it aside. And it'll never be your best work. There will be writers who say to you that, this whole book happened for me and I wrote it in 3 weeks and I wrote it in 6 years, 6 days. The honest truth is writing takes time. Give yourself all the time that you need to make the work that will hold across time and space. That's the only permission that you need to give yourself. Be with your work.
Siddharth, there are many questions, but I don't think we have the time to answer everything Asad has shown up on our screen. I want to thank Asad very specially for allowing me the privilege of this conversation, for Avid Learning, where learning truly never stops. When Siddharth and I spoke, and we spoke a lot about this conversation, we prepared for it like this was the first time we were talking to each other. And if anyone wants any advice from me, do everything like it's the first time. Do it with your heart in your mouth. I haven't been able to eat all day because I'm nervous that I can't do my best. Because I love what I do. And thank you for this gift of words and books, Siddharth. What a beautiful book, really. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being my friend.
Thank you, Siddharth. Thank you, Nonita. I mean, this is a wonderful conversation. I mean, I was talking to Siddharth earlier. I said, you all have such history, chemistry, rapport, and even respect that this conversation was destined to be what it was. I mean, great. But I actually have been sitting here, I've been scribbling notes. I mean, it's very unlike me because my team does that generally. I have like 4 pages, A4 size of quotes and notes and Siddharthisms and Nonitaisms, and including my book, which I just got yesterday. And, Padmini sounds wonderful. I mean, I love the 12 meals a day diet. I mean, I want to go on that one. No, honestly, guys, it's been amazing. And, Siddharth, since this has been your passport and inspiration to the next book, you got to promise me that the next book you will collaborate with Avid Learning. You can run, but you can never hide. And Nonita, we've been in touch over the years, and this was just a wonderful experience. And thank you so much for sharing. And both of you all have had loss. I've experienced loss of both my parents also. So I take a different perspective from this session, which is very personal. And I think the amount of questions, I think people are going to get pissed off with us because there were so many questions and we couldn't answer it. But that's for Avid 2.0 session when they come back. But thank you again. We have many, many more interesting sessions planned out. Next one is on Saturday, the 6th of February, which is uncovering the urban legacies of the Jewish diaspora in Mumbai, and many more. So for more information, just stalk us on social media or check out our website. And until next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and remember that learning never stops. Thank you so much again, Nonita, Siddharth. What a wonderful session. Thank you.
I'm so grateful to you and to Avid. Thank you so much.
Good night. Thank you, Nonita.
Thank you.